The Germans found the first body at precisely 0647 hours. Feldwebel Conrad Miller was standing in the commander's hatch of a lead Panzer IV, his breath blooming in the frozen air. Through his field glasses, he scanned the tree line. He was confident. He was part of a steel tide, 12 tanks, 8 half-tracks, and hundreds of elite infantry. To them, the Americans were in full retreat, a broken force falling back through the Ardennes. The road ahead was supposed to be a highway to victory. Then, something punched through Miller's forehead. He dropped into the turret without a single sound. For 30 seconds, the column behind him didn't even react. They thought he ducked inside to check a map. They thought he was dodging the biting wind. They assumed everything except the impossible truth. Somewhere in that ancient frozen forest, invisible and terrifyingly patient, a single American rifleman had just started a 6-hour nightmare. The German officers scrambled. They scanned the hedgerows. They aimed their machine guns at a ruined farmhouse to the east. They saw nothing. No smoke, no movement, no flash. According to their intelligence, the American lines were 2 kilometers south. There shouldn't have been a soul here. And yet, their commander was dead before he could even scream. H.E. Goggerth hugged the wooden stock of his M1903 Springfield. He wasn't in a foxhole. He wasn't behind a stone wall. He was 93 feet in the air, strapped to the trunk of a towering Norway spruce with a length of stolen rope. The bark dug into his spine. The thin branch beneath his boots groaned. And with every gust of winter wind, the entire tree swayed in a nauseating, slow-motion rhythm that threatened to throw his aim wide. He didn't care. He had found his spot, and he wasn't coming down until his bandolier was empty or every German in that column was dead.
This is the story of a man his own platoon called a birdman, a man who was mocked, laughed at, and told his plan was a suicide mission. 2 weeks earlier, when Aaron Ward proposed his idea to the platoon sergeant, the reaction wasn't respect, it was ridicule. The American lines were collapsing under the weight of the German winter offensive. Panic was the primary emotion in the camp. But Ward had been studying the maps. He noticed a bottleneck, a single road through the forest that was the only viable route for heavy armor. The ground on either side was a marshy, wooded trap. To move the tanks, the Germans had to use that road. And that road passed directly beneath a stand of ancient trees that towered over the forest like cathedral spires. "I can see everything from up there," Ward had told his sergeant. "I can see the officers. I can see the radio men. If I get high enough, I can stop them." The sergeant had laughed until he nearly choked. "You want to climb a tree during an artillery duel? Strap yourself 90 feet up with no cover and no way down? Son, that's not a fighting position. That's a suicide tower. The first crowd who sees you will put a tank shell through your chest and splatter you across 3 counties." The other soldiers joined in. They asked if he was going to lay eggs. They joked that he was so scared of the ground war he wanted to hide in the clouds. Ward didn't argue. He didn't defend his honor. He just nodded, walked away, and waited for the sun to go down. That night, while his unit dug traditional foxholes in the frozen dirt, Ward disappeared into the dark with a bag of ammo, 50 feet of rope, and a Springfield rifle. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to prove that a single man in the right place is worth more than a battalion in the wrong one.
The sniper's paralysis. Climbing a 90-foot spruce in total darkness in the middle of a sub-zero winter is a feat of strength most men couldn't achieve in a gym, let alone on the front lines of a world war. Ward felt his way up, branch by branch. The frozen bark scraped his palms raw. The wind numbed his fingers until he could barely feel the wood. Twice his boot slipped and he dangled over the abyss, saved only by instinct. But at 90 feet he found it, a natural cradle where 3 thick branches met the trunk. It was just wide enough to wedge his body into. He wrapped the rope around his waist and the trunk. This was a literal no-retreat policy. If the Germans spotted him, he couldn't jump. He couldn't climb down fast enough to escape. He was part of the tree now. As the gray dawn touched the treetops, he heard it, the low, rhythmic thrum of the German advance. 12 Panzers, 8 half-tracks. It was exactly as he'd predicted. He centered his crosshairs on the man in the lead hatch. Range, 400 yards. Wind, light northwest. He adjusted for the drop. He exhaled, letting his lungs empty, and in that crystalline moment between heartbeats, he squeezed. When Conrad Miller ceased to exist, the column didn't just stop, it paralyzed. This is a phenomenon military psychologists call sniper paralysis. It wasn't about the casualties. Losing 1 man out of 800 is statistically nothing. It's about the uncertainty. The Germans didn't know if they were facing a squad, a company, or a ghost. Because they couldn't see a muzzle flash, they assumed the shooter was at ground level, hidden in the dense brush or the ruined farm buildings hundreds of yards away. Ward waited. He didn't get greedy. He let 3 minutes pass. He watched the German officers shout, watched the infantry dismount and take cover behind the heavy steel of the half-tracks. He let them convince themselves that the first shot was a fluke, a lone straggler who had already run away. Then he saw his second target, an officer standing by a command vehicle, pointing at a map and directing a squad toward the tree line. Crack! The officer dropped. The map fluttered into the snow, turning red. Chaos erupted. Machine guns swiveled toward the forest floor, spraying thousands of rounds into the bushes and the trunks of the smaller trees. The sound was deafening, a wall of lead shredding the undergrowth. But Ward was 93 feet above the lead. He watched the bullets chew up the ground where any sane sniper would be hiding. He felt a grim satisfaction. The Germans were elite troops, vets of France and Russia, but they were trained to fight enemies they could see. They weren't prepared to be hunted by a shadow in the sky. Over the next hour, Ward fired only 17 rounds. He wasn't spraying and praying. He was performing surgery. First, he took the officers, then the radio operators, then the machine gunners. He was systematically lobotomizing the column. Without officers to give orders or radio men to call for help, the 800-man force became a headless giant. They were stationary, vulnerable, and terrified. By 2008, the German commander made his first desperate mistake. He ordered a Panzer IV to fire its 75mm main gun into the tree line.
The Siege of the Spruce. At 0900 hours, the Germans decided to stop guessing. They deployed specialized infantry squads to sweep the forest. Ward watched them through his scope. They were good moving from cover to cover, checking every fallen log, every ditch, and every thicket, but they made one fatal mistake. They never looked up. Military doctrine states that snipers use ground cover because elevated positions are suicide towers. They're too exposed. There's no escape route. The Germans were following the book. Aaron Ward had thrown the book away the night he stole that rope. He waited until the search squad was directly beneath his tree. He was looking at the tops of their helmets. He tilted his Springfield down at a nearly vertical angle. The shot was haunting. The bullet entered the top of a soldier's helmet and exited through his pelvis. His squad mates spun around, firing blindly into the bushes. They thought the shot had come from behind a log just feet away. Ward shifted behind the thick trunk of the spruce, pressing his body into the dark bark. He was invisible. The Germans were so close he could hear them swearing in frantic, hushed tones. They fired hundreds of rounds into the canopy above, shredding branches and raining pine needles down on themselves. One bullet struck the very branch Ward was standing on. Splinters sprayed his face, drawing blood. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He waited until the German fire died down, until they began to retreat to their vehicles, convinced the ghost had slipped away again. Then he leaned out and killed 2 more. By now, the column had been stationary for 4 hours. The German schedule was ruined. The breakthrough they were supposed to achieve was stalling, giving the retreating Americans miles away precious time to dig in and reset their lines. But at 1100 hours, the sound of the forest changed.
The fall of the Birdman. Aaron Ward was no longer Birdman. He was a ghost that refused to leave the living world. Through the smoke of the first 150-millimeter explosion, he leaned out. His hands were shaking so hard he had to wedge his rifle against the trunk to steady it. He didn't use the scope anymore. It was shattered. He aimed by instinct, by the memory of where the targets were. He fired. Another German fell beside the half-track. The Germans reacted with pure, unadulterated terror. They had just leveled a section of the forest with a siege gun, and the demon was still shooting. The Brummbär fired again. This shell was closer, 20 feet. The concussion cracked Ward's ribs. He didn't feel the pain, only the sudden inability to take a full breath. The branch beneath his boot splintered, hanging by a few threads of frozen wood. He was dangling by the rope now, his body hammered against the trunk. Still, he reloaded. He fired one last time, hitting a German sergeant who was trying to rally a squad to charge the woods. Then came the third shell. There was no dramatic final speech. There was no pain. 1 second, Ward was pulling the trigger, focusing on the front sight post of his Springfield. The next second, the world became fire and splinters. The 93-foot Norway spruce, the fortress that had protected him for 6 hours, simply disintegrated. Private First Class Aaron Ward fell through the black smoke and the falling snow. He fell 93 feet into the wreckage of his own position. The forest went silent.
The most telling part of the story isn't the shooting, it's what happened after Ward died. The German column, hundreds of men and dozens of armored vehicles, remained stationary for another 40 minutes. Even with the sniper's tree reduced to kindling, even with the forest silent, the officers were too afraid to move. They were convinced it was a trap. They were convinced there were more birdmen waiting in the canopy. By the time they finally mustered the courage to roll forward, they had been delayed for 6 hours and 12 minutes. In the world of the Ardennes offensive, 6 hours was an eternity. While Ward was holding that road, the American units he had been part of were busy. They had used those 6 hours to find high ground. They had used them to establish new defensive lines, to bring up anti-tank guns, and to coordinate a counterattack. The highway to victory the Germans had expected was gone. Because of one man in a tree, the German breakthrough in that sector never materialized. They had lost the momentum, and in winter warfare, momentum is everything. 3 days later, the Americans pushed back. They retook the road. They found the wreckage of the giant spruce. And in the middle of the splintered wood and the frozen mud, they found him. Aaron Ward was still clutched in the debris of his spruce. His Springfield was still in his hands. His bandolier was empty. He had fired every single round he carried.
The men who had mocked him fell silent. The jokes about laying eggs and Birdman died in their throats. They looked at the road, littered with German brass and the remains of the command structure, and they realized what he had done. He hadn't been hiding in the sky. He had been holding it up.
The Silver Star and the Legend. The sergeant who had called Ward's plan a suicide tower was the one who wrote the recommendation for the Silver Star. The official citation is dry. It speaks of conspicuous gallantry and extraordinary marksmanship. It mentions that he delayed an enemy armored column for a period exceeding 6 hours. But the citation doesn't tell the real story. It doesn't mention the cold that turns your blood to slush. It doesn't mention the nausea of a 90-foot sway in a winter gale. It doesn't mention the psychological iron it takes to watch a 150mm siege cannon point its barrel directly at your face and decide to keep pulling the trigger. Aaron Ward didn't die because his plan failed. He died because he refused to leave his post until the job was done. For decades, Ward's story was one of those soldiers' tales, the kind of thing whispered in VFW halls, but left out of the grand history books. The big history of WWII focuses on generals and maps and sweeping arrows of movement. It rarely has time for a private first class with a length of rope and a stubborn streak. But for the men of his unit, Aaron Ward became the ghost of the spruce. He represents a terrifying truth of combat, that technology, armor, and numbers can be defeated by a single determined human spirit. The Germans had the tanks, they had the siege guns, they had the numbers, but Aaron Ward had the high ground, and he had the heart to hold it. His story serves as a reminder to never mock the man with a crazy idea. Sometimes the thing that looks like a suicide mission is actually the only thing that can save the day. If you go to that forest today, the Norway spruces still stand. They are tall, dark, and silent. And if you stand on that road southwest of the ridge, you can almost feel it. The weight of 1,000 German soldiers looking up into the green, searching for a ghost they could never find.
Stories like Aaron Ward's are the reason we do this. Because history isn't just dates and treaties. It's the sound of a Springfield rifle cracking in the winter air. It's the silence of a man who knew he was going to die and decided to make it count. If this story moved you, if you think Private Aaron Ward deserves to be more than just a footnote in a dry textbook, do me a favor. Smash that like button. It's a small thing, but it tells the YouTube algorithm that these are the stories that matter. It helps us keep these memories alive for the next generation. And if you're not subscribed yet, click that button and hit the bell. Next week, we're diving into another impossible last stand, a story about a lone medic who walked into a minefield with nothing but a bandage and a prayer. Before you go, I want to hear from you in the comments. Honestly, if you were strapped to that tree and you saw that 150mm siege gun start to elevate its barrel toward you, what would you have done? Would you have stayed, or would you have tried to climb down?